This is not going to be easy.
Grave of the Fireflies is one of those films that leaves a certain indelible impact on you after seeing it. Few films can leave someone so emotionally drained like Fireflies, and yet it has been lauded from top to bottom by seemingly everyone. I believe Spoonie said it best when he told me that it was the greatest film he never wanted to see again. And considering it's the story of Seda and his toddler sister Setsuko as they struggle to survive in war-torn Japan during the final stages of World War II, once is all you need.
The overall somber and sobering tone of this film is one of the reasons why this is going to be so difficult. The other reason is, considering how universally acclaimed and lauded this film is, any kind of dissenting opinion would just be regarded as trolling or just being contrary. I guess this is my long-winded, roundabout way of saying that I really don't like this film. At all.
Yeah, I said it. I really don't like it. And no, it's not because it's a sad movie, and no, it's not because I'm trying to stir the fan base up. I don't like this film for reasons that are much more detailed than just pettiness. But we'll get into that soon enough.
I think it's important that we cover why people revere this film so much, and give a little history and background to the people that are still not in the know. Plus, it will give angry commenters more time to write out their angry comments. Win-win.
Grave of the Fireflies was based off a 1967 novel by Akiyuki Nosaka, who wrote the book as amends for his guilty conscience. To this day, no English translation of the novel exists. The film was released in 1988 by Studio Ghibli, the only Studio Ghibli film that Disney never held the rights to. The film didn't reach mainstream audiences until the early 2000s, when Roger Ebert declared it one of the greatest war films ever made, and even agreed to do an interview for the special features on the DVD.
You know, I've seen a lot of war films, and many of them are exciting or moving or dramatic or artistically effective. And a few of them actually reach you at an emotional level and not just at the action level. I was amazed the first time I saw Grave of the Fireflies to find that I was actually moved just about to tears by this film.
Even Roger Ebert, who has seen pretty much every sad film that has ever existed, was moved by Grave of the Fireflies. That is the defining characteristic of this film. It is unabashedly, unrelentingly sad, and the audience has no choice but to connect with the film, unless they're completely dead inside.
The depressing nature of the film is nigh inseparable from its legacy. Hell, the very first scene of the film is the ghost of Seda looking at himself dying on the streets, shortly joined by the ghost of Setsuko. From the very first minute to the very last, the viewer knows that they're in for an inevitably sad end. Honestly, there isn't much to the movie outside of it being a sad movie. When you break down the story to brass tacks, you begin to realize how simple the plot is. While the film is your standard 90 minutes, the entire story can be completely summarized in a paragraph. Even the majority of the film's dialogue is Setsuko and Seda talking to each other like how we expect older brother and baby sisters would. Seda being condescending and comforting, and Setsuko being naive and endearing.
Are you okay, Setsuko?
I lost one of my shoes.
I'll buy you even better ones.
I have money.
Huh?
Open this.
Wow, Setsuko, you're rich.
Almost no one's dialogue drives the plot forward, what little plot there is to drive. So how does the film reach the hour-and-a-half mark with a story this bare bones? Lots of padding.
After their mom perished in an air raid and are sent to their aunt to live with, Setsuko and Seda spend most of their time frolicking on beaches or playing out in the woods. Unlike with most films, the padding here does serve a purpose other than to stretch the runtime, but it's that same purpose that I take issue with, and is really the crux of why I really do not like this film.
That purpose? Manipulation.
These scenes where Setsuko plays in a tub with her brother or plays with a crab out on the beach have little to do with the plot, but they do portray what the audience perceives as actual childlike behavior. In every sense, Setsuko acts and talks like a real child would, and Seda acts, for the most part at least, like how a responsible older brother would. However, do not take this to mean that they have character, or that they're really characters at all. Setsuko and Seda are more constructs than characters.
What do I mean by that? Well, it's hard to articulate, but consider how the film treats the two.
Both Setsuko and Seda are thrust into the worst sort of situation imaginable, and it slowly erodes them over the course of the film, which is standard for any kind of sad story. However, unlike other films where the audience sympathizes and connects with the characters that they've come to know and perhaps identify with, the audience sympathizes with Seda and Setsuko especially because the idea of their situation is inherently sad. In the big picture, it doesn't matter if it was Setsuko and Seda suffering or if it were two other children, so long as they retain verisimilitude.
We're not sad that Seda and Setsuko are suffering, we're sad because we're watching kids die. And that ties into what I was saying about the film's manipulative purpose.
Considering the emaciated plot, there's no real point to its story. Neither character learns anything or takes anything away from over the course of the film, even when it sets up that possibility by having Seda swallow his pride and return himself and his starving sister to the care of his mean-spirited and passive-aggressive aunt, if it meant that Setsuko could have proper food and shelter.
Don't you have any other relatives?
I don't know how to contact them.
Then take my advice and go back to that woman, son. Everything's rationed now. You can't survive outside the system. Just swallow your pride and apologize.
Thanks anyway. I'll just go and ask someone else.
However, the film never follows up on this, as if Seda never had a moment's doubt that staying away from his aunt was the right choice. What could have been a defining moment of Seda's character is instead treated as just another unfortunate happenstance along the way to an inevitable and unavoidable end. However, though Fireflies lacks a stated moral, for lack of a better term, the film does have a stated goal, according to the director Isao Takahata in an interview back in '88. Takahata intended for the film to invoke sympathy from its audience, especially teenagers.
If Takahata's goal was to tell a story that reached people on an emotional level, that's one thing. But if the entire point was to reach people on an emotional level, story or no, that's entirely different.
You could say that most every sad film is guilty of manipulation in this way, but the best sad films don't make you aware they're manipulating you. Fireflies, on the other hand, couldn't be more obvious if it tried, and nowhere is it more apparent than after Setsuko dies. The film goes into a montage of Setsuko doing little girl things for no reason other than to make the audience sad, all to the tune of a wistful operatic aria. What's worse, this montage is from the audience's point of view. This isn't Seda remembering her because he's not anywhere to be found, so how could he be remembering something that he wasn't there for? This is just what the film thinks the audience will find sad. The breaking point, however, is when Setsuko uses a bowl as a helmet and snaps a salute to no one. This is contrivance at its purest.
Simply put, the more you try to force an emotion on the screen, the harder it is to hide the artifice, and it's no longer about telling a story. Now, some of you might be asking what's so wrong with Takahata wanting to make a film that connects with its audience. Well, remember he said that there was a focus on the younger generation and teenagers. This is where it becomes a little bit more devious.
If you do the math, the teenagers and 20-somethings of 1988 would have been born between the early 60s and the mid-70s, so their parents would have been the children that had grown up during World War II. So we have this generation gap of parents who had lived through arguably the darkest period of Japan's history, and the children who grew up in an era of unprecedented wealth and prosperity. Parents were understandably frustrated with their children who had been spoiled by society's abundance, and the youth were equally as frustrated with outdated and authoritative parenting. This rift was the root of Japan's social problems regarding juvenile crime rate and delinquency. Starting in 1979, the number of arrested juveniles per 1,000 had rapidly increased to the highest it had ever been since at least 40 years, and stayed there for the entire decade, eventually petering off in 1993. And its peak in 1984, there were 300,000 made arrests. This trend is reflected in a lot of anime and manga at the time, as numerous stories dealt with teenage rebellion and gang violence. Where do you think Katsuhiro Otomo got the inspiration for the motorcycle gangs in Akira when he created it in 1982?
What does this all mean? It means Takahata intended to wrangle this troublemaking generation into parental compliance through guilt.
True, he didn't word it quite like that, but when Fireflies juxtaposes a scene of affluent, happy-go-lucky young people who are relieved to find all their stuff had survived a bombing with that previously mentioned montage of Setsuko, it becomes quite clear what Takahata meant and why the film specifically targets the younger generation. The real defining moment, however, comes at the very end, as the ghosts of Setsuko and Seita sit on a park bench overlooking modern Kobe. Already the message is clear enough, but right before the cut to the cityscape shot, Seita breaks the fourth wall and gives the audience a grave, accusatory look, as if to say, "This is what happened to your parents, you ingrates."
Am I the only one who finds this kind of awful? I mean, even if Takahata only intended for the best and truly wanted to inform the younger generation of the hardships during the aftermath of World War II, co-opting someone else's personal tragedy and fabricating events to suit this intended goal is straight up duplicitous.
As I stated, Grave of the Fireflies was adapted from a novel, a semi-autobiographical novel. Nosaka based the book on his own experience growing up during wartime, and how he felt responsible for letting his sister die of starvation. He talked about purging demons from his past that had haunted him for decades, dedicating the book to her when it was published in 1967.
His story is understandably tragic, and it's a good starting point for a film with this kind of goal in mind. But why did the film have him die?
Well, if Seita had survived, just like Nosaka, then he would have stopped being a construct and started being a defined character. He would have had to deal with survivor's guilt and be damning his pride that kept him from going back to live with his aunt. The only moment, by the way, that Seita exhibits a characteristic that doesn't revolve around being an older brother. However, this also would have made the story too insular and personal, making it harder for the intended generation to project their own parents into the film. It would be Seita's story, not their parents'. So, Seita dies, and whatever guilt he may have felt and would have struggled with, dies with him.
I know that adapted films often change details from its source material, but they're usually changed for accessibility reasons, or for reasons regarding their respective differences between mediums. But when they're changed because they wouldn't have fit the director's intended vision, that's usually when the adaptation goes off the rails.
Still, I want to make it very clear that there is no evidence that suggests that Nosaka was dissatisfied or even slightly miffed with these changes they made to his story, or if he took issue with the film using what happened to him in the way they did. I'll be the first to admit that I'm reading a lot into what went into this film and forming my own conclusions, but I hope that you're able to see how I came to these conclusions and better understand my problems with the film.
To an American audience in the 21st century, this talk of wanting to manipulate Japanese teenagers in the 80s is sort of a moot point, since the film was never made for an American audience in the first place. So from our perspective, we can see the film as an anti-war film that brutally depicts what war reduces humanity to. But even that has been taken away from us by Takahata.
Unlike with his previous statement about wanting to invoke sympathy with teenagers, Takahata was extremely clear about how Grave of the Fireflies was never meant to be an anti-war film. The film is not at all an anti-war anime and contains absolutely no such message. There's no wiggle room in that statement, and no other way to interpret that but literally. So does that mean that every critic who ever lavished praise on the film and called it an important anti-war film, or one of the most devastating anti-war films ever made, animated or otherwise, are provably wrong?
While Takahata has no control over how people see his film, he does have control over its intent. If people want to see an anti-war message in the film, that's their right to, but it's incidental. And to insist that there is an anti-war message would infer ignorance.
I'll admit, the first time I ever saw the film, I did cry, and I enjoyed the film overall. But the more I watched the film and thought about it, and the more I learned about the history of the times and social context, the more it irked me on a moral level. The obvious playing into people's emotions, the underhanded nature of its intent, and the manipulation just angers me personally.
I said at the beginning of this review that I did not like Grave of the Fireflies, but I can't bring myself to hate it, because at the end of the day, I can recognize that it's a very well-made film, but it ethically repulses me and I can't get around that fact. Well, I'm sure that none of you out there wanted me to take this show into this depressing area, so next time around we're going to have a return to form. Lucky me. Till next time.